Flames still breathed from the black ribs of Sarah Whitlock's ranch. Smoke crawled across the prairie like a wounded thing. 3 graves waited behind the barn. Her husband, her brother, and the life she used to know. Sarah Whitlock rode through the ashes anyway. Straight to the man who burned it. Victor Hale stood beside the smoking corral, calm as Sunday morning. Coins clinked in his gloved hand. Sarah slid from the saddle. Eyes dry. Voice steady. "Victor Hale, you wanted my land." She opened her palm. "I'll give it." The wind died. "But first, you make a deal with me." Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Smoke drifted low across the Whitlock ranch like a tired ghost. Black beams jutted from the ground where the barn once stood. The wind pushed ash across the yard in thin gray sheets. Sarah Whitlock stood in the middle of it, boots sunk into cold soot. 3 wooden crosses leaned crooked behind the house. Her husband, her brother, and the hired hand who tried to drag the fire buckets through the flames. The prairie wind rattled the loose boards of the burned porch. The sound scraped against the quiet like a broken door knocking. Sarah did not move. Her dress smelled of smoke that would never wash out. The ranch house behind her had one wall left standing and half a roof sagging like an old saddle. A lone iron pot swung on the cracked kitchen hook. It clanged softly every time the wind shifted. The sound carried across the empty yard. Somewhere far off, a crow cried over the blackened pasture. The cattle were gone. Driven off in the dark the night of the fire. Sarah Whitlock reached down and picked up a charred horseshoe from the dirt. It crumbled in her hand. Ash fell through her fingers like gray snow. She stared at the road cutting through the prairie grass. Victor Hale's road. Every rancher in the valley knew it led back to his big house on the ridge. Hale owned half the water, half the cattle, and most of the men who carried rifles in this county. Sarah turned away from the graves. The wooden crosses creaked softly as the wind leaned against them. She walked toward the half-standing house. The porch boards groaned under her weight. Inside, the kitchen lay open to the sky. One chair remained upright beside the table. The others had burned down to twisted legs and charcoal ribs. The iron stove ticked faintly as it cooled from the fire that had eaten the house. Sarah placed her hand on the table. The wood felt rough and cold. A place where laughter used to live. Now only wind lived here. Outside, hooves struck the frozen ground. Slow. Careful. A horse approached the yard. Sarah did not reach for a weapon. There was none left to reach for. The hoofbeats stopped beside the broken gate. Leather creaked softly as someone dismounted. Boots touched the dirt. A man stepped through the open doorway. Tall. Dusty. A long rifle rested across his back. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He stopped just inside the kitchen. For a moment neither of them spoke. Wind slipped through the broken roof and brushed ash across the floor. The stranger looked around at the burned walls. At the empty chairs. At the 3 crosses visible through the shattered window. His voice came quiet. "You the one still holding this place together?" Sarah did not look at him. "This ranch is already gone." The man stood there a moment longer. Boot leather creaked as he shifted his weight. Then he reached back and closed the warped kitchen door behind him. The hinge groaned. The wind outside softened. And the stranger stepped fully into the ruined home. Morning came gray and brittle. Cold light slipped through the broken roof and spread across the kitchen table. Ash still coated the floor in thin powder. The iron stove stood silent in the corner. Daniel Crow crouched beside it. His gloved hand brushed soot from the iron door. The metal scraped softly. Sarah Whitlock sat across the room, back straight in the lone surviving chair. She had not slept. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the burned boards of the porch. Daniel opened the stove door. Empty. Cold. He stood slowly. "Got any wood left that ain't charcoal?" Sarah's eyes stayed on the floor. "Pile behind the shed. If Hale's riders didn't haul it off already." Daniel nodded once. Boots creaked as he stepped back outside. The cold air rushed into the kitchen. Wind carried the smell of old smoke and frozen grass. Sarah listened to his footsteps cross the yard. Then the dull crack of wood breaking. A few minutes later the stranger returned. Arms full of rough-cut logs. He dropped them beside the stove. Dust puffed into the air. He knelt again and struck flint against steel. The sparks snapped bright in the dim kitchen. Dry twigs caught. A thin flame curled upward. Soon the stove ticked and popped as warmth crept through the iron. Sarah watched the small fire grow. It had been 3 days since she'd seen flame that wasn't destroying something. Daniel closed the stove door. The iron rattled softly. Warmth spread slow across the room. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the wind pressed against the broken boards. The ranch creaked like an old ship. Daniel stood and looked through the cracked window. The pasture stretched empty. No cattle. No horses. Just black earth and drifting ash. "You planning to rebuild it?" he asked quietly. Sarah's voice stayed flat. "Don't matter what I plan." She finally looked at him. "Victor Hale already owns it. Fire just saved him time." Daniel studied the horizon a moment. Then he turned back to the room. He walked to the broken cupboard. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside sat a single tin plate and a cracked coffee cup. He set the plate on the table. Fire don't always mean finished. Sarah gave a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "You don't know Victor Hale." Daniel did not answer. Outside, somewhere down the valley road, hooves echoed faintly. Sarah's head lifted. The sound drifted through the cold air. Riders. Not close. But close enough. Daniel heard them too. His eyes shifted toward the window again. The hoofbeats faded after a moment. Silence returned. But it felt thinner now. He reached for another log and fed the fire. The stove popped louder this time. Warm air curled through the kitchen. The room slowly thawed. Hours passed with quiet work. Daniel patched the broken door with 2 boards pulled from the barn ruins. The hammer blows echoed sharp in the empty yard. Each strike carried across the prairie. Sarah worked inside. She swept ash from the floor with a broom made from dry brush. The bristles rasped softly across the wood. Gray dust gathered into small piles. Wind still slipped through the broken roof. But the room began to look like a place meant for living again. By afternoon the stove glowed faint red. The kitchen smelled of warm iron and wood smoke. Daniel stepped back inside, brushing frost from his coat. Sarah had found a sack of beans beneath the half-burned cabinet. The pot simmered on the stove. Water bubbled gently. The sound filled the kitchen. Alive. Daniel sat across from her. The chair creaked under his weight. For the first time the house made ordinary sounds. Fire cracking. Pot rattling. Spoons touching tin. They ate without talking. Outside the sky darkened with evening clouds. Cold crept back toward the land. Daniel wiped his mouth and leaned back. "You told Hale you'd give him the land?" Sarah nodded. "In 3 months." Daniel's brow tightened slightly. "That his idea?" "No." "Then why 3 months?" Sarah stared into the fire through the stove's small grate. Flames flickered gold against her eyes. "So I can rebuild enough for him to take something worth stealing." Daniel studied her quietly. The stove popped again. A sharp sound in the still room. Wind scraped the porch boards. Then another sound carried faint across the yard. Leather creaking. A horse shifting. Both of them turned toward the window. A rider stood at the far fence line. Watching. Too far to see clearly. But the shape of the hat was enough. One of Hale's men. The rider lingered for a moment. Then turned the horse slowly and rode off into the fading light. Sarah looked back at the stove. Her hands tightened slightly around the tin spoon. Daniel said nothing. But the room felt colder again. He stood and walked to the door. The boards he nailed earlier rattled softly as he pushed it open. Night wind rushed across the yard. He stepped onto the porch. The prairie stretched dark and quiet. The rider was gone. But hoof tracks scarred the dirt near the gate. Daniel crouched beside them. Fresh. Watching tracks. He stood again and looked toward the ridge where Victor Hale's big house sat somewhere beyond the hills. Then he walked back inside. The stove glowed brighter now. Sarah had added more wood. The warmth pushed back against the creeping cold. Daniel set his rifle beside the door. The wood stock tapped the floor softly. Sarah noticed. "You expecting trouble?" Daniel pulled a chair closer to the stove. His voice stayed calm. "Trouble's already here." The fire cracked louder. Outside the wind rose again. The ranch groaned softly in the dark. But inside the small kitchen, warmth held its ground. Morning crept across the Whitlock ranch slow and pale. Frost clung to the blackened fence posts. The burned barn still smelled of wet ash. Inside the kitchen, the stove glowed soft red. Wood snapped and shifted behind the iron door. Daniel Crow stood near the window, rubbing warmth into his hands. The glass rattled faintly in the wind. Sarah Whitlock stirred the beans left from last night. The spoon scraped the bottom of the pot. A quiet sound. A living sound. Steam rose toward the broken beams overhead. Outside, the prairie stretched empty and white with frost. Daniel watched the land a long time. Fence lines gone near the creek. Sarah didn't look up. "It burned. I can fix it." She paused. The spoon rested against the pot. "Why?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "Because cattle wander." A faint breath escaped her nose. "We don't have cattle." Daniel turned from the window. "Maybe someday again." Silence settled between them. But it was a softer silence than before. The stove ticked. The pot bubbled gently. Sarah filled 2 tin cups with weak coffee. The smell drifted warm through the kitchen. She slid 1 cup across the table. Daniel nodded once. Boots creaked as he sat. They drank quietly. Outside, the wind rattled loose boards against the porch. The sound echoed hollow across the empty yard. After a moment, Daniel stood. He grabbed his coat from the chair. "Fence first," he said. Sarah watched him go. The door opened with a dry groan. Cold air rushed inside. Then the door shut again. The stove popped louder. Warmth slowly reclaimed the room. Hours passed. The hammering began late morning. Sharp metal strikes carried across the pasture. Clang. 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 Sarah stepped onto the porch. Her breath fogged in the cold. Daniel worked near the creek bend, driving new posts into the frozen ground. Each hammer blow echoed across the quiet valley. The sound felt strange. The ranch had been silent too long. Now noise returned. Work noise. Living noise. Sarah walked toward the garden patch beside the house. Most of it had burned. But beneath the frost she found a small patch of stubborn green. Onion shoots. Still alive. She knelt and brushed ash from the soil. The earth felt cold and hard. But not dead. Far off down the road a faint rumble carried through the wind. Sarah looked up. Dust drifted along the distant trail. A wagon. Moving slow. She stood still, watching. Daniel's hammer stopped near the creek. He had seen it too. The wagon rolled closer. Then slowed. 2 riders appeared behind it. Dark coats. Wide hats. Sarah's stomach tightened. Daniel walked back toward the house. His boots crunched frost across the yard. By the time he reached the porch, the wagon had stopped near the gate. One rider leaned forward in the saddle. Victor Hale's brand burned into the leather saddlebags. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the porch rail. The riders watched the ranch, watching the smoke rise from the chimney, watching the fence posts standing again near the creek. One rider spat into the dirt, then turned the horse. The wagon creaked forward again. They rolled away down the road. Sarah let out a slow breath. "They'll tell him." Daniel nodded. They already did. The wind shifted across the yard. The porch boards creaked beneath them. Sarah crossed her arms against the cold. "You should leave." Daniel looked at her. "Why?" "Because Victor Hale doesn't like strangers helping people he already owns." Daniel's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "I don't belong to him." Sarah turned away. "You don't know this valley." Daniel leaned his shoulder against the porch post. "I know men like Hale." The stove crackled inside the house. Warmth spilled faintly through the door cracks. Sarah opened the door and stepped back inside. The kitchen felt warmer than the day before. Less hollow. The table held 2 cups instead of 1. Daniel followed a moment later. Cold air rushed in behind him. The door shut with a dull thud. He placed a coil of wire on the floor beside the wall. Sarah looked at it. "You plan to fence the whole ranch?" Daniel shrugged. "Start somewhere." She returned to the stove. The pot rattled gently as the beans warmed again. The fire glowed brighter now. Outside, the afternoon wind began to rise. Loose boards clapped softly along the burned barn frame. Daniel sat near the stove. His boots stretched toward the heat. For a moment the room settled into quiet again. Fire snapping. Wind outside. Tin cup tapping the table. Then Sarah spoke without turning. "You said yesterday you knew something about the fire." Daniel stared into the stove grate. Flames flickered across his eyes. "I said I might." Sarah faced him now. The kitchen seemed smaller suddenly. "What do you know?" Daniel reached down and nudged a log deeper into the coals. The wood cracked sharply. "I know Hale didn't burn your ranch for land." Sarah's brow tightened. "Then why?" Daniel looked toward the window. Toward the blackened barn ruins. Toward the hills beyond. "Because someone here had something he wanted hidden." The words settled into the room like cold air. The stove popped again. Loud this time. Sarah's voice dropped. "What?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind carried a distant sound across the valley. Hoofbeats. More than one. Moving fast along the road. Daniel stood slowly. His chair scraped the floor. Sarah turned toward the window. Dust rose along the distant ridge trail. Riders. Coming down toward the Whitlock ranch. The stove crackled behind them. Warmth pressing against the growing cold. And the ranch waited. The riders reached the Whitlock gate before the dust settled. Hooves struck the frozen ground with dull thuds. Leather creaked. Bits clinked. 3 men sat their horses without hurry. The morning air carried the smell of cold iron and damp earth. Inside the kitchen, the stove crackled steadily. Daniel Crow stood beside the window. Sarah Whitlock wiped her hands slowly on a rag. Neither of them spoke. A fist pounded the door. The boards rattled in the frame. "Open up." The voice carried the lazy confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Sarah walked to the door. Daniel did not stop her. But his eyes followed every step. The latch lifted with a dry scrape. Cold air flooded the room. 3 riders stood on the porch. Long coats. Dusty boots. Victor Hale's brand burned into their saddle leather. The man in front smiled thin. "Morning, Miss Whitlock." Sarah said nothing. The rider glanced past her shoulder. Smoke drifted from the stovepipe. His eyes narrowed. "Well now." He leaned one elbow on the porch rail. "Looks like someone decided not to leave after all." Behind Sarah, the stove popped loudly. Daniel stepped forward just enough to be seen. The rider's smile faded a fraction. "Didn't know you had company." Daniel's voice stayed quiet. "Just passing through." The rider studied him. Cold eyes. Measuring. "Mr. Hale says the land belongs to him now." Sarah answered. "He said 3 months." That was before he heard hammering echo across the valley. The man's boot shifted on the porch boards. Wood creaked. He's curious why a burned ranch suddenly sounds busy again. Silence stretched between them. The wind rattled loose in along the roof. Finally the rider straightened. "Mr. Hale will come see things himself soon." He tipped his hat slightly. "But he doesn't like surprises." The riders turned their horses. Hooves clattered down the porch steps. In a moment the sound faded down the road. Sarah closed the door slowly. The latch clicked. Warmth crept back into the kitchen. But it felt thinner now. Daniel returned to the stove. He placed another log inside. The fire snapped sharp against the iron. Sarah leaned against the table. "He'll come now." Daniel nodded. "Men like him always do." The pot simmered softly. Steam rose into the cooler above the stove. For a moment the only sound in the house was the fire breathing. Outside the wind picked up. The broken barn frame groaned like an old ship in rough water. Daniel grabbed his coat. "I'll finish that fence." Sarah looked up. "After what they just said?" Daniel shrugged. "Fence still needs finishing." The door opened again. Cold rushed in. Then it shut. The hammering returned to the valley. Clang. 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 The noise carried across the pasture. Sarah stood in the kitchen listening. The sound of work. The sound of defiance. Hours passed beneath gray clouds. By afternoon the sky darkened. Snow threatened along the hills. Daniel returned near sunset. His boots dragged mud across the porch boards. The door groaned as he pushed inside. The stove glowed warm and steady. Sarah had found dried onions in a cracked jar. The smell of soup filled the kitchen. Daniel paused in the doorway. For a moment he just listened. Fire popping. Soup bubbling. A spoon tapping softly against the pot. Living sounds. He stepped closer to the heat. Sarah handed him a bowl. Their fingers brushed briefly. Cold skin against warm. They ate slowly. Outside the first flakes of snow drifted across the yard. Wind hissed softly against the house walls. Halfway through the meal Daniel spoke. "You asked yesterday about the fire." Sarah set her spoon down. "Yes." Daniel stared into the bowl a moment. Steam curled up into his face. "I rode with Hale's men once." The words fell quiet and heavy. Sarah didn't move. Daniel continued. "Long before your ranch burned." The stove popped again. "Those men don't burn land for cattle." Sarah's voice stayed calm. "Then why?" Daniel looked toward the dark window. Snowflakes tapped faintly against the glass. "Because something on that land scared them." Sarah frowned. "My husband owned nothing worth that." Daniel shook his head slightly. Maybe he didn't know he did. The fire cracked louder. Outside the wind rose against the walls. Then another sound crept through the storm. A distant rifle shot. Sharp. Echoing across the valley. Both of them froze. The silence afterward felt thick. Daniel stood and walked to the window. He wiped frost from the glass with his sleeve. Far across the pasture a dark shape lay near the creek. One of the fence posts had been knocked down. Beside it something moved weakly. Daniel grabbed his coat again. Sarah rose quickly. "What is it?" Daniel opened the door. Cold air blasted inside. "Your last calf." Snow swirled through the yard. The wounded animal struggled in the frozen grass. And somewhere beyond the hills the echo of that rifle still hung in the air. Snow fell through the gray evening like quiet ash. Daniel Crow ran across the yard. Boots slammed frozen dirt. The wind cut hard against his coat. Sarah Whitlock followed close behind. Her breath burned in the cold. The calf lay near the broken fence post. Small. Brown. One hind leg twisted under its body. A dark stain spread slowly across the white snow. The calf tried to stand. Collapsed again. A thin cry slipped from its throat. Daniel dropped to one knee. His gloved hands moved careful and quick. The wound sat high in the leg. A rifle shot. Clean. Cruel. Sarah's voice came tight. "Can you save it?" Daniel pressed a hand against the bleeding. Warm blood soaked through the glove. "Maybe." The calf shivered violently. Snow gathered along its back. The wind howled through the fence posts. Daniel pulled a strip of cloth from his coat pocket. He wrapped the wound tight. The calf cried again. Weak. But alive. Sarah knelt beside him. Her hands trembled. Why would they shoot it? Daniel tied the knot and looked toward the hills. Because it was the last thing on this ranch still breathing. The wind pushed harder across the pasture. Snow scraped along the ground in thin white streams. Daniel lifted the calf. It struggled weakly in his arms. "Help me." Sarah rose and hurried toward the barn ruins. Together they carried the animal through the broken doorway. The barn smelled of old smoke and damp wood. Snow drifted through the missing roof beams. But the wind dropped enough to quiet the storm. Daniel set the calf down in a corner where boards still blocked the draft. The animal's breath came thin and fast. Sarah spread a blanket beneath it. The cloth rustled softly against the straw. Daniel knelt again and checked the bandage. Blood still seeped through. But slower now. The calf blinked at them. Daniel rubbed its neck gently. "Stay with us, little one." Outside the wind screamed across the valley. Then another sound cut through it. Hoofbeats. Slow. Measured. Daniel's head lifted. Sarah froze beside him. The hoofbeats stopped outside the barn. Leather creaked. A man laughed softly. The barn door pushed open. Cold air swept inside. 3 riders stood framed by the snow. Lantern light from the house flickered faintly across their coats. Victor Hale's men. The one in front swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the dirt with a dull thud. "Well now." His voice carried lazy amusement. "Looks like our little message reached you." Sarah stood. Her hands clenched at her sides. "You shot a calf." The rider shrugged. "Just practicing." Behind him another man chuckled. The sound echoed hollow in the ruined barn. Daniel remained kneeling beside the calf. His hand still rested on the animal's neck. The rider noticed him. His eyes narrowed. "You again." Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Leave." The rider stepped closer. Boots crunching frozen straw. "Mr. Hale says this ranch belongs to him." Snow blew through the broken roof and swirled between them. "He also says stubborn folks sometimes need encouragement." The rider nudged the wounded calf with his boot. The animal cried out weakly. Sarah lunged forward. "Don't touch it." The man smiled slowly. "Careful, Miss Whitlock." Daniel stood. The barn suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. Even the wind seemed to pause. Daniel's eyes met the rider's. "Cold. Steady. Walk away." The rider laughed. "You threatening me?" Daniel said nothing. Behind him the calf struggled again. Its breath wheezed softly in the cold air. The rider steadied Daniel a moment. Then spat into the dirt. "Not tonight." He stepped back toward the door. "But Mr. Hale will come soon." The other riders mounted their horses again. Snow swirled around them. The leader tipped his hat slightly. "Next time we won't waste a bullet on cattle." The horses turned. Hooves pounded the frozen road. The sound faded slowly into the storm. Silence filled the barn again. Only the wind remained. Sarah sank to her knees beside the calf. Her hand shook as she touched its neck. Daniel stood near the doorway watching the dark road. Snow covered the hoofprints quickly, but the message remained. He closed the barn door with a heavy shove. The wood groaned in the frame. Inside the barn the calf breathed softly. Sarah whispered, "They'll come back." Daniel turned toward her. The wind rattled the roof beams overhead. "Yes." He stepped closer to the calf and checked the bandage again. Warm blood still pulsed faintly beneath the cloth. The animal blinked slowly. "Alive. For now." Sarah looked up at him. "What do we do?" Daniel walked toward the door and looked out at the dark valley. Far off on the ridge a faint lantern flickered. Victor Hale's house. Watching. Waiting. Daniel's voice stayed quiet. "We keep breathing." The wind roared through the valley again. And somewhere beyond the hills a lone rifle cracked in the distance. Morning came sharp and pale. The storm had passed in the night. Snow covered the Whitlock ranch in a thin white sheet. The burned barn stood quiet against the frozen sky. Inside the barn the calf breathed softly. Daniel Crow knelt beside it. The animal's eyes blinked slow and tired. Steam drifted from its nostrils. Daniel peeled back the bandage. The cloth stuck to dried blood. He worked gently. The calf twitched but stayed still. Sarah Whitlock stood nearby holding a lantern. The flame flickered against the barn walls. The smell of warm oil pushed back the cold. "How bad?" she asked. Daniel studied the wound. Bullet passed through. Sarah exhaled slowly. "That's good. Means it can live." The calf shifted weakly. Its hooves scraped against the straw. Daniel tied a fresh bandage tight around the leg. The animal let out a quiet cry. But it did not collapse. Daniel rubbed its neck. "Strong little thing." The lantern flame crackled softly. Outside the barn the morning wind whispered across the snow. Sarah stepped closer to the door. She pushed it open. Light spilled across the yard. For a moment the ranch looked peaceful. White snow covering black scars. Smoke rising thin from the chimney. But the silence felt wrong. Too quiet. Sarah frowned. There should be birds. Daniel stood slowly. What? Every morning. Blackbirds near the creek. She listened. Nothing. Just the wind sliding across the pasture. Daniel walked outside. His boots crunched the snow. The cold bit hard into his lungs. He scanned the ground. Tracks covered the yard. Not cattle. Not deer. Horses. Many. Circling. Watching. Sarah stepped beside him. Those weren't there yesterday. Daniel crouched and brushed snow aside. Fresh prints cut deep into the dirt beneath. Riders had circled the ranch during the night. Slow. Patient. Studying the land. Daniel straightened. They're measuring us. Sarah's voice tightened. For what? Daniel looked toward the hills. For the day they take it. The wind rose suddenly. Loose boards clapped against the barn frame. Inside the calf cried weakly again. The sound broke the silence. Daniel returned inside. The lantern flame flickered harder now. He placed fresh straw beneath the calf. The animal's breathing had steadied. Sarah leaned against a post. How many riders? Daniel thought a moment. 6. Maybe 7. Her eyes widened slightly. That's Hale's crew. Daniel nodded. They're testing how scared we are. The barn creaked softly. Snow slipped from the roof beams. Then a distant sound drifted across the valley. Metal clanging. Slow. Heavy. Sarah stiffened. What is that? Daniel walked to the door again. He stepped into the cold. Far across the lower pasture something moved. A wagon. Rolling slow along the fence line. The wheels groaned loudly in the frozen dirt. The noise carried across the valley like a warning bell. 2 riders followed behind it. Victor Hale's men. The wagon stopped near the creek bend. Daniel watched them unload something. Long wooden posts. Barbed wire. Sarah joined him. "They're fencing." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not fencing." He pointed. "They're closing the road." The riders hammered posts into the ground. Clang. 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 The sound echoed across the empty pasture. Each strike carried clear through the cold air. Sarah stared. "That's the North Trail." Daniel nodded. "They're cutting us off." The hammering continued. Clang. 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 The noise scraped through the valley like a slow drum. Inside the barn the calf shifted again. Its breathing grew restless. Sarah whispered, "They're trapping us." Daniel did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the men working the fence. The barbed wire unrolled across the snow like a steel snake. By afternoon the wagon moved again, rolling farther down the fence line. Hammered blows followed. Closer now. Louder. The sound pounded against the quiet ranch. Sarah covered her ears briefly. "They want us to hear it." Daniel finally spoke. "Yes." The sun dipped lower toward the hills. Cold shadows stretched across the yard. The wagon stopped again near the lower gate. The riders climbed down. One of them raised a rifle. He fired into the air. The crack split the valley open. The calf inside the barn panicked. It tried to stand. Collapsed hard into the straw. Sarah ran to it. "Easy. Easy." Daniel stepped inside. The barn felt colder suddenly. The calf trembled beneath her hands. Daniel placed his palm gently on its neck. "Quiet now." Outside the riders laughed. The sound drifted through the broken barn wall. Cruel. Careless. After a moment the wagon rolled away again. The hammering faded. Silence returned. But the silence no longer felt peaceful. Sarah stared at the door. "They're building a cage around us." Daniel looked down at the calf. Then toward the house where the stove smoke curled into the cold sky. His voice stayed calm. "Then we break it." The wind pushed through the valley again. And far across the ridge the lantern at Victor Hale's house flickered in the coming dark. Morning came with a thin layer of frost across the yard. The Whitlock ranch stood quiet under pale sunlight. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a slow gray ribbon. Inside the kitchen the stove glowed steady. Wood snapped behind the iron door. Sarah Whitlock poured water into the tin kettle. The metal rang softly against the stove top. Daniel Crow sat at the table sharpening a knife. Stone scraped steel. A slow, steady rhythm. Outside the wind pushed across the pasture. The barbed wire fence glinted along the north trail. Victor Hale's cage? Sarah glanced toward the window. They finished it. Daniel did not look up. For now. The kettle began to rattle softly. Steam curled into the cool air. Sarah set 2 cups on the table. The room felt warmer than the cold morning outside. But the warmth could not reach the fence line. Daniel finished the blade and wiped it clean. The scrape of the cloth sounded loud in the quiet room. Sarah slid a cup toward him. He nodded once. They drank in silence. Then the wind carried a distant sound. Hooves. Many. Daniel set the cup down. The tin clinked softly against the wood. Sarah moved to the window. Dust rose from the road. Riders. Coming straight for the house. Daniel stood slowly. His chair creaked. "Stay behind me." Sarah did not answer. She remained by the window. The riders reached the yard. 7 men this time. They spread across the open ground like wolves circling a carcass. In the center rode Victor Hale. Tall. Broad-shouldered. His coat dark and clean despite the dust. He dismounted slowly. Boots struck the frozen earth. The porch boards groaned as he climbed the steps. Daniel opened the door before Hale knocked. Cold air swept into the kitchen. Victor Hale stepped inside without asking. His gloves creaked as he removed them. He looked around the room. The stove. The table. The repaired boards. The 2 cups of coffee. Well. His voice rolled smooth and calm. Looks like the Whitlock place found new life. Sarah stood across the room. Her eyes steady. You said 3 months. Hale smiled faintly. And I admire a woman who holds a bargain. His gaze slid toward Daniel. The smile thinned. But I didn't agree to share the land with strangers. Daniel remained silent. The stove popped behind him. Firelight flickered across the iron door. Hale stepped closer to the table. His boots thudded softly against the wood floor. You know who I am? Daniel met his eyes. Yes. Then you know this valley runs by my word. Daniel shrugged slightly. I've heard that. Hale chuckled. Low. Amused. Then you must also know men who ignore my word usually regret it. Outside a horse snorted. Leather creaked. The riders shifted in their saddles. Sarah spoke quietly. He's helping rebuild. Hale turned toward her. That's generous. His smile vanished. But generosity can look like trespassing. Daniel leaned one shoulder against the wall. The wood creaked under his weight. What do you want? Hale removed a folded paper from his coat. The parchment crackled in the quiet room. A reminder. He laid the paper on the table. The inked seal caught the firelight. A legal claim to this property. Sarah stepped forward. Her hands tightened. You promised time. Hale tapped the paper with one gloved finger. I did. His eyes lifted slowly. But your rebuilding has made something clear. The wind rattled the window glass. Hale's voice dropped colder. You're hiding something. The room went still. Daniel said nothing. Hale studied both of them. You think I burned this ranch for land? The stove cracked sharply. Flames flickered through the grate. Hale leaned closer to Daniel. I burned it because your husband found something. Sarah's breath caught. What? Hale smiled faintly again. If you knew, you'd already be dead. The words hung in the warm kitchen air. Daniel's voice stayed calm. Then why come today? Hale straightened. His coat brushed softly against the chair. Because I don't enjoy waiting. He looked toward the door. His riders shifted outside. 7 shadows through the frosted glass. 3 months is a long time for trouble to grow. Sarah stood tall despite the tremor in her hands. You made a bargain. Hale nodded slowly. I did. He stepped toward the door. Cold wind leaked through the cracks. But bargains can end early. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. How? Hale opened the door. Snow dust swirled into the kitchen. His riders turned their horses toward the house. Hale looked back over his shoulder. If the land becomes unsafe. He stepped outside. Boots thudding across the porch. The riders circled the yard again. One of them leaned from his saddle. His boot slammed hard into the newly repaired fence post. Wood cracked. The post splintered and fell into the snow. Another rider tore a wire loose from the porch rail. The metal screeched loud in the quiet morning. Sarah rushed to the doorway. Stop. Hale raised a hand calmly. The riders paused. He looked at Sarah. 3 months. His voice carried soft and final. But every broken fence shortens that clock. The riders laughed quietly. Hooves churned the snow as they turned away. The sound of their departure rolled across the valley. Soon only the wind remained. Daniel closed the door slowly. The latch clicked. The kitchen fell silent again. Fire cracked inside the stove. Sarah stood frozen beside the table. They're going to tear this place apart. Daniel walked to the window. Outside, the broken fence post lay half buried in snow. The riders had already vanished beyond the ridge. Daniel spoke quietly. "Then we make sure they can't." Dawn came quiet over the Whitlock ranch. Frost clung to the broken fence posts. The valley lay still beneath a pale sky. Inside the house, the stove glowed steady. Wood cracked softly in the fire. Sarah Whitlock stood at the table, tying a strip of cloth around her hands. Daniel Crow leaned near the window. The rifle rested across his palms. Outside, the yard stretched silent. Too silent. The barbed wire along the north trail shimmered faint in the morning light. "Victor Hale's cage?" Sarah finished tying the cloth and looked up. "You're certain they'll come today?" Daniel watched the ridge. "They always come when they think the ground is ready." The kettle rattled softly on the stove. Steam rose thin and white. Warmth filled the small kitchen. But the warmth felt fragile. Outside, the wind shifted across the pasture. Then a sound broke the quiet. Hooves. Many. Daniel's eyes hardened. "Now." Sarah moved to the window. Dust rolled down the road like a low storm. Riders spread across the ridge. More than before. 10. Maybe 12. Victor Hale rode at the front. His coat moved slow in the wind. Sarah's breath caught. "That's half the valley." Daniel opened the rifle chamber. Metal clicked. "They're done pretending." The riders entered the yard without slowing. Hooves pounded the frozen ground. Snow burst beneath the horses. Victor Hale raised one hand. The riders fanned out around the house, cutting every path. Sarah stepped back from the window. The stove popped sharply. Daniel walked to the door. "You stay inside." Sarah shook her head. "No." He looked at her. She lifted her chin. "This is still my ranch." Daniel paused, then nodded once. They stepped outside together. Cold air struck hard against their faces. The riders watched in silence. Leather creaked. Bits clinked. Victor Hale dismounted slowly. His boots landed in the dirt. The sound echoed across the yard. "Well." His voice carried calm and smooth. "Looks like you decided to greet us." Sarah stood straight. "You said 3 months." Hale glanced toward the broken fence. "Your ranch has become troublesome." One of the riders nudged his horse closer. The animal snorted clouds into the cold air. Daniel rested the rifle loosely in his hands. Not raised, but ready. Hale noticed. His eyes flicked to the weapon. "Careful, stranger." Daniel's voice stayed quiet. "This land isn't yours." A few riders laughed. "Short. Cruel." Hale smiled thinly. "Oh, but it will be." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The parchment snapped lightly in the wind. "Legal claim." Sarah didn't move. Daniel spoke instead. "You burned the ranch." The yard went still. Hale's smile faded slightly. "That's an ugly accusation." Daniel took a slow step forward. Boots crunching frost. "You burned it because Sarah's husband found something." A rider shifted uneasily in the saddle. The horse stamped. Hale's eyes narrowed. "You talk too much for a drifter." Daniel lifted the rifle. "Not aiming. Just holding. I used to ride with your men." The riders exchanged quick glances. Hale's voice sharpened. "And?" Daniel's eyes stayed locked on him. "I was there the night they burned the Whitlock barn." The wind hissed through the yard. Sarah turned toward him. Hale laughed suddenly. Loud. Sharp. "A confession?" Daniel shook his head. "A witness." He reached into his coat slowly. The riders tensed. Several rifles lifted slightly. Daniel pulled out a folded oilskin packet. He held it up. The paper inside crackled in the wind. Hale's smile vanished. "Where did you get that?" Daniel unfolded the parchment. Survey lines scratched across the page. Ink marks. Old signatures. This valley was surveyed 30 years ago. The wind snapped the paper again. Daniel raised his voice. Sarah Whitlock's family owns the water rights under every acre here. A ripple moved through the riders. Murmurs. Confusion. Hale stepped forward fast. That's a lie. Daniel shook the paper slightly. You burned the ranch looking for this. The riders stared at the map. Hale's face tightened. Give me that. Daniel lowered the rifle and tucked the paper back into his coat. No. For a moment nobody moved. The wind carried the faint creak of the barn. Then Hale's voice dropped. Cold. Kill him. The first rifle cracked. The sound shattered the valley. Daniel moved before the echo died. His rifle fired once. A rider's hat flew from his head as the man tumbled from the saddle. Horses screamed. Sarah dove behind the porch rail. More gunshots ripped through the air. Wood splintered from the house wall. Daniel fired again. Another rider fell. The smell of powder filled the cold yard. Hale shouted orders. Chaos erupted among the horses. Daniel stepped backward toward the porch. Steady. Precise. Each shot measured. The riders hesitated. 2 already down. The rest uncertain. Sarah crawled behind a barrel near the door. Her heart pounded loud in her ears. Gunfire cracked again. A bullet smashed the porch post beside Daniel. Wood shards sprayed across the snow. Daniel fired once more. The rider aiming at Sarah dropped from his saddle. Silence fell suddenly. Only the wind remained. 3 men lay in the snow. The rest of Hale's riders backed their horses slowly. Victor Hale stood frozen in the yard. Daniel lowered the rifle slightly. Smoke curled from the barrel. The valley watched. The ranch watched. Hale's eyes burned with rage. This isn't finished. Daniel's voice stayed calm. It is for today. The riders gathered behind Hale. Uncertain now. Uneasy. Hale mounted his horse slowly. Leather creaked. He stared once more at the house. At Sarah. At Daniel. Then he turned the horse. The riders followed. Hooves thundered down the road. The sound faded into the hills. The wind returned to the valley. Daniel lowered the rifle. The yard lay quiet again. Only the stove smoke curled gently from the chimney behind them. And the Whitlock ranch still stood. The yard stayed quiet long after the riders disappeared over the ridge. Only the wind moved. It pushed snow across the ground in thin silver ribbons. Daniel Crow stood near the porch. The rifle hung low in his hands. Smoke drifted from the barrel. Sarah Whitlock stepped slowly out from behind the porch rail. Her boots crunched frost. 3 horses wandered riderless near the broken fence. The men who fell lay still in the snow. No one spoke. The valley held its breath. Sarah finally looked at Daniel. What did you do? Daniel opened the rifle chamber. Metal clicked softly. He slid the empty shells into his pocket. What needed doing? The wind rustled the burned barn frame. Sarah walked toward the fallen men. Her steps slowed. The sight of them turned her stomach. She turned away. They'll come back. Daniel nodded once. Yes. He walked to the nearest horse and caught the loose reins. The animal snorted and stamped. Its breath rolled warm into the cold air. Daniel tied the horse to the fence post. Then another. Then the third. The work felt quiet and steady. Sarah watched him. You said you were there the night my ranch burned. Daniel paused. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Yes. The wind scraped dry grass along the snow. Sarah's voice tightened. You helped them. Daniel did not answer right away. He walked slowly back toward the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. Inside the house the stove cracked warmly. The sound carried through the open door. Daniel rested the rifle beside the wall. Then he turned toward her. "I rode with Hale's crew for 2 winters." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Needed money." His voice stayed flat. "Men like Hale always have money." Sarah crossed her arms. "And when he ordered the fire?" Daniel looked toward the barn ruins. The black beams cut against the sky. "That was different." The wind pushed harder across the yard. Daniel's eyes stayed on the ruins. "Hale heard rumors about something buried on this land." Sarah frowned. "Buried?" Daniel nodded. "Not gold." He reached slowly into his coat. The oilskin packet slid free again. The parchment crackled as he unfolded it. Survey lines stretched across the page. Old ink. Old signatures. Sarah stepped closer. "I saw that earlier." Daniel tapped the corner of the map. "Water." She blinked. "What?" Daniel traced the lines. "These marks show underground springs." He tapped again. "The largest one runs straight through your pasture." Sarah stared. "That's just water." Daniel shook his head slowly. "In this valley, water means cattle." The wind rattled the porch rail. "And cattle means power." Sarah looked toward the distant hills. Toward Victor Hale's ranch. "He wanted the spring." Daniel nodded. "He already owns half the valley's water." He folded the map carefully. "But this spring would control the rest." Sarah's voice turned bitter. "So he burned my home for a well." Daniel's eyes hardened. "He burned it because your husband found this survey." Sarah's breath caught. "My husband never told me." Daniel slipped the map back into the oilskin. He was planning to file the claim in town. The wind blew stronger now. Snow whipped across the yard. Hale learned about it first. Sarah looked toward the graves behind the house. The wooden crosses leaned in the cold wind. "He killed them for paper." Daniel said nothing. Silence spread between them. Only the stove cracked inside the house. Warm. Steady. Finally Sarah spoke again. "Why didn't you give that map to him?" Daniel's eyes lifted. He asked. "And?" "I said no." The wind rattled the broken fence wire. Sarah steadied his face. "You rode with killers. But you kept this." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Some things shouldn't belong to men like Hale." The calf cried faintly from inside the barn. The small sound drifted across the yard. "Alive." Sarah glanced toward the barn. "He'll come back for that map." Daniel nodded. "Yes. And next time he won't leave." The wind carried a distant rumble from the ridge. Hooves again. Faint. Far away. But coming. Daniel looked toward the hills. "They're gathering." Sarah's shoulders straightened slowly. Her fear hardened into something steadier. "What do we do?" Daniel looked at the house. Smoke curled warm from the chimney. The sound of the stove crackling drifted through the open doorway. The first real warmth this ranch had known in weeks. Then he looked at the pasture. At the hidden spring beneath the frozen ground. "This land belongs to you." Sarah met his eyes. "And Hale will never accept that." Daniel picked up the rifle again. The wood stock tapped softly against the porch. "Then we make sure the whole valley knows the truth." The wind carried the distant thunder of riders over the hills. Closer now. And the Whitlock ranch waited. Spring arrived slowly in the Whitlock Valley. Snow melted from the pasture in thin shining streams. The burned barn no longer smelled of smoke. Fresh boards stood where black beams once leaned. A new roof caught the morning light. The ranch breathed again. Inside the house the stove crackled steady. Not desperate warmth. Just comfort. Sarah Whitlock stood at the kitchen table rolling dough. Flour dusted the wood surface. The rolling pin thumped softly. Outside the window sunlight spread across green grass. A low sound drifted through the open door. Cattle bells. Slow. peaceful. Sarah paused and listened. The sound still surprised her. 3 months ago the valley had been silent. Now the land spoke again. Boots creaked on the porch. Daniel Crow stepped inside. He carried a small bucket of clear water. The liquid shimmered bright in the morning light. Spring's running strong. Sarah smiled faintly. Good. He set the bucket beside the sink. Water splashed softly against the metal basin. The sound felt rich. Life in a dry valley always sounded like water. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth. The stove popped gently. The smell of baking bread filled the room. Sarah glanced at the open window. Town meeting starts soon. Daniel nodded. They'll be there. He meant the ranchers. The farmers. Men who had watched Victor Hale rule the valley for years. Now they had seen the map. Seen the proof. Seen Hale ride away with half his men gone. The valley had changed. But echoes of that morning still lingered. Sarah walked to the doorway. The pasture rolled wide beneath the rising sun. Fence lines stood repaired. The barbed wire Hale had strung across the north trail lay coiled useless near the creek. Daniel joined her. For a moment neither spoke. The wind carried the sound of hooves far down the road. Sarah's body stiffened slightly. Daniel noticed. Relax. She exhaled slowly. Hard habit to break. The hoofbeats passed without stopping. Just a rancher riding toward town. No rifles. No threats. Still, the memory lingered. Daniel leaned against the porch post. You did the right thing. Sarah looked at him. Telling the valley about the spring? He nodded. Men can't steal what everyone knows exists. Sarah watched the cattle grazing near the lower field. The same ground where riders once circled in the dark. My husband would have liked this. Daniel said nothing. The wind moved gently through the grass. Then a small sound reached them. Hello, uneven move from the barn. Sarah smiled. She's awake. Daniel pushed off the porch rail. Let's check on her. They walked across the yard together. Sun warmed the dirt beneath their boots. The barn door creaked open. Inside straw rustled softly. The young calf stood on steady legs now. The bandaged leg healed clean. She turned her head toward them. Eyes bright. Alive. Daniel rubbed the animal's neck. You're stubborn. The calf nudged his coat. Sarah laughed softly. The sound filled the barn. Warm. Honest. Daniel stepped outside again. The valley spread wide beneath the blue sky. Smoke curled gently from the house chimney. A wagon rolled slowly along the distant road. Neighbors coming to see the ranch. Not enemies. Not riders with rifles. Just people. Sarah joined him beside the door. You staying? Daniel looked across the pasture. The spring water shimmered where it flowed from the hillside. Cattle moved lazily along the stream. He shrugged lightly. Someone has to keep fixing fences. Sarah's smile deepened. The wind shifted through the valley. Grass rustled in long waves. Then the sound returned. Soft. Familiar. The stove door creaking open inside the house. Wood settling in the fire. The gentle crackle of flames. Months ago that sound had fought the cold. Now it carried through the ranch like a quiet promise. Warmth lived here again. Sarah looked toward the house. Bread's probably ready. Daniel nodded. They walked back across the yard together. Behind them the calf's small bell rang softly as she moved through the straw. In the distance cattle bells answered across the pasture. Slow. Peaceful. And the Whitlock ranch stood in the sunlight. Alive. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.